The Wild Children by Felice Holman. An interesting acknowledgement. Although this book is fiction, it is based on carefully examined facts. Russia was a closed society in the early 1920s when the story takes place, and the news coming out was mostly heavily weighted propaganda. For help in getting the information I needed, I want to particularly thank, and there are a couple of individuals. But first listed is Margaret Mead, the late great anthropologist, whose casual reference to the wild children of Russia stirred my interest and started my research. And then there's a bunch of other research individuals. Someday there will be written the epic of Moscow's homeless children, highwaymen, murderers, and dope fiends almost before their bones have hardened. Now one can only give a scant glimpse of their curious lives and obscure deaths. From New York Times Communiqué by Walt Durante, November 14th, 1925. Chapter 1. People had been disappearing. Everyone knew that. And yet, when Alex came down to breakfast and found his whole family had been taken away, his mother, his father, his younger sister Nadia, and his old grandmother, he couldn't quite believe it. He hadn't heard a thing because of his crazy room, just a little cell on the second floor that had been used for storage. Small, stuffy, with only a tiny window near the ceiling, giving dim light. He disliked it heartily because he had to go through his parents' room and then push through all the stored things, old clothes, quilts, boxes, to get to his bed. He'd been secretly angry when they had made him move from the room that he and Nadia shared with its window above the garden so that Nadia could have it all to herself. It had seemed entirely unfair, but he was accustomed to obeying without protest. He had long understood that the rights of children were limited to the wishes of parents. Now he thought that it was probably the crazy room that had saved him. With the GPU, the secret police, when the GPU, the secret police, came to take everyone away, they'd overlooked the storeroom. Certainly the only good thing about that room was its isolation. One could take one's feelings there and hide them, and not be distracted from one's brooding by sounds of people talking, wagons, or trucks rolling over the cobblestones, or gunshots. It was a good retreat, too, for working on tricky math puzzles that his teacher, Katriana Sergeyeva Sokolova, invented for him. When he had come down to breakfast, there wasn't a sign of anyone. No fire in the grate. There wasn't even the detested smell of scorched oatmeal. But even before that, the first thing that had alerted Alex and started the wave of fear had been the chair overturned in the front hall. His mother, tidy as she was, would never have allowed a chair to remain that way for more than a moment. Her insistence on neatness was why he stood there so early in the morning. Well groomed, brushed, combed, boots polished, to avoid her saying, "Alex, let me see. Did you lose your brush? That is not the clean shirt I put out for you. What happened to the shoe wax? Did it evaporate?" He straightened the chair and called hesitantly, "Mama? Papa?" When there was no answer, he called, "Nadia? Grandmother? Where is everyone?" The chilly house with its cooling hearth seemed to echo with an echo. Nary one. And even as he called, a very cold feeling started in his chest. Tight, frightened, it could have happened to them. Like birds in winter, snow in spring, people had been disappearing for months, years now, yet none dared talk about it except in the privacy of their home with the curtains drawn. But Alex knew that certain people and even whole families were being arrested and sent away. Sent where? Why? There were many guesses, but there was no pattern. They only knew it was political, like everything else these days. Since the Civil War and the Revolution, nobody was really safe. Yet Alex's father behaved as if they were. He was not political. He did not go to private meetings of revolutionaries or counter-revolutionaries. Still, the Civil War had made enemies of very ordinary people who had no idea why they had become enemies. Alex's father had told him that much. But he was an educator, the administrator of several schools. It was not a political job, not then anyhow. He told his teachers not to discuss politics with the students in their classes. It was not their business. Yes, but then why had they taken away the fat old postmistress one day when she was sorting mail? What could an old woman like that have done? Alex had asked his father, but he had only shrugged. The Levchenko family down the road had been dragged out to a closed van one day just as Alex was coming home from school. Mr. Levchenko, an engineer, stooped and pale, his wife crying and the children clinging to her, carrying no possessions. Alex had known Satya Levenchko very well. His father had said, "Try not to think about it." Alex had tried, but nevertheless it was one of those things he thought about a great deal in his crazy room, away from distracting sounds and activity. Once, a few years ago, his uncle Dmitri in Moscow had sent him a very shiny stone. "This will turn to gold," he had written, "if you hold it in your hand and not think of camels." Alex had tried and tried to banish the thought of camels from his mind as he held the stone, but he could not. He could not forget the Levchenkos either, despite his father's advice. In his little room, he often wondered how life could be so perilous for people, even though his father had told him that the new government was a people's government. Still, it was people who were taken away and shot, and hundreds, thousands streaming along the roads, the edge of town, going anywhere, nowhere, made homeless by this people's government. There were months at a time when the town had had no meat, no milk, no bread. The peasants were being forced to give up their farms, their cattle, grain, farm implements, and join collectives. Many of them burned their fields instead. Alex understood that the Tsar had been selfish and cruel, and that was why there had been a revolution and a civil war. But then why wasn't better now? These are the things he thought about. The Tsar of Russia is what would be a king in English. When he asked his father about that, his father had spoken carefully. "Perhaps it will be better. Do you remember the famine? Even people like us had difficulty getting food at all, and thousands died of hunger. Now you have oatmeal on the table nearly every morning, don't you? We have this rich soup at night, and sometimes meat. There is bread from the government store most of the time. You would be wiser, Alex, not to think about whether this government is better or worse. If you live your life in an orderly and honest way, be obedient, do your work well, and mind your own business, you will prosper." "Yes, but Papa, the police come and take the people." "Speaking historically," his father had said, "revolutions cause changes. Didn't you read about the French Revolution?" "People were beheaded," Alex had cried. "Yes," his father had replied, "blood ran in the streets." I remember the fighting in the streets here in Kovrov," Alex recalled. "I remember the blood then. I remember—" "Try not to think about it," his father had said. There it was again, the stone that would not turn to gold. For a while that particular morning, a shocked and frightened Alex kept walking around and around the house, as if he might be able to find his family if he kept going around long enough. Finally, through the fear came the knowledge that he might be in danger himself. In the case of the Levchenkos, a new family had moved right into the house the very same day, a commissioner of the Agricultural Authority with an office in the town hall. So Alex went back to his crazy room and hastily gathered some things. He had a few kopecks, coins, of his own, in a black lacquered box, and he put them in the pocket of his jacket. He put on his warm coat and woolen hat, and taking his book bag, went through the house, closing all the doors. He watered his mother's plant with a red flower in the sunny front window, and put out a crust for the birds as he always did. Then he went out and closed the door. Somehow he felt like a thief sneaking away from the house with his school bag. He looked up and down the street, felt nobody noticed him, then ran across the road and started over the bridge. At first he didn't really know where he was going. He just had to get away from the house before the secret police returned or the new tenants moved in. He passed the great old church and its beautiful blue dome, and for a moment of precious lapsed memory, he thought he could run in and ask the help of the old priest. But just as quickly the idea was trampled by two recollections of a night a few years ago when soldiers had stormed the church and taken the icons, candelabra, and chalices. That night, hundreds of the faithful had fought with pitchforks and sticks to try and save the icons, but they were beaten and the ringleaders sent before a firing squad. After that, the church had been closed and the priest taken away and shot. The bells had been melted for cannonballs the year before. The church, now a granary, stood like a holy specter. Alex's mother had taken over his and Nadia's religious training. It was permitted that three other children take part in this home instruction, and so his special friend Grisha and Grisha's little sister and brother had come to the house once a week to study with them. But there was no mass, no sacraments, no beautiful chants, and his mother was quietly bereaved. Her room was tiny without enough light, and yet it was pleasant in its way. He could see that when he had entered and closed the door, the small bed was covered with an old red quilt. Above it was a blue and gold icon. A green velvet chair stood next to a table that was covered in an elaborately embroidered scarf. On the wall over the weathered wooden trunk was a summer scene, a field with a river beyond. Alex sat down and waited, staring deeply into the painting, thinking of summer and walking in the hills with his father's old friend Tolka, who lived in the wild, sleeping on the ground, eating berries, and with no companions but the wolves. He tried to concentrate on that and not think of the frightening trouble that had upset him. Once again, it was like not trying not to think of camels. It was dark by the time Catriona came in with several things in a basket. Alex was slumped in the chair, napping, and awoke to find her poking at the stove. She started speaking as fast as he greeted her. I'm so sorry you had to wait so long. There was such a long line for bread that I was afraid they'd run out of it before I'd reach the counter. So I did something I've never done before. I paid a homeless waif who was selling places. I could have done that at first and wouldn't have wasted so much time, but I don't like to encourage them to come here. As long as we give them coins or they're able to steal something, they'll stay around and plague us, making us feel guilty. I don't know why the government doesn't do something. Oh, I'm just saying that, but I know perfectly well that anything the state can do is not enough. All they can do is ignore them or arrest them and punish them for having no homes. There are just too many of them, and they are so abysmally in need. Finally, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked straight into Alex's eyes. I am prattling on because I don't want to tell you what I must. I'm afraid you are right. Alex could only nod his head. I walked past your house several times to see if there was any activity. The third time I walked down the street, I saw Grisha coming out of your gate. I pretended to be passing by. I said, Good evening, Grisha. All through with your game? And he said, Nobody's home. They must have all gone visiting. So I waited until dusk and walked past again to see if there were any lights. There are none, Alex. Of course, there's always the chance that they have indeed gone visiting, as Grisha said, or that life seemed to stop. He heard himself say, No, not at supper hour, certainly not since morning. He felt as if this was happening to someone else and he was watching it. His voice sounded far off and muffled in his ears. Well, we'll see tomorrow, Catriona said. Now try to eat some bread with sausage and a little tea. She poured the hot black tea into the little decorated cups and cut the sausage and bread. These she put on an embroidered cloth, and they sat together in the light of the grate. In his most secret dreams, Alex had imagined him sitting thus with Catriona, although he had never seen the room before. Now it was as if the dream had contained all these details: the embroidered cloth, the trunk, the worn green velvet chair, the picture on the wall. But his dreams had been joyous, and this was full of pain. At first they sat silently, but finally Alex asked, Why would they take my father? What could he have done? What could any of them have done? The thousands, Catriona mourned softly. Your father is a good man, a fine man, but perhaps today that is not enough. The new government will want the students to be taught to think a particular way, as the government thinks. Perhaps your father is too, well, neutral, impartial. I have read some government writings about education. The Bolsheviks know that the idea of communism, if the idea of communism is to succeed, the children will have to be taught very young to think as they are told to think. Of course, that is one of the purposes of the Komsomol, the youth organization, and many of the children are joining that. But my father is very strict, Alex said. I must always do what he says. Perhaps, Catriona replied. But do you always think as he thinks? No, Alex said. I go to my crazy room and think as I wish to think, and when I am fully grown up, I shall be able to do as I wish as well. Yes, Catriona said, smiling. I hope that is true. Unlike his crazy old room at home, Catriana's room picked up the noises on the street, the rumble of wagons and vans over the rough cobbles, the calls of children. Then there came a steady drumming of boots on stone, the passing of a patrol of soldiers who were billeted in the old grain warehouse at the edge of town. The citizens had come to accept the soldiers as part of the new way, but even so, it was disturbing to hear the volleys of shots that rang out during practice hours. It made everyone remember the terrible days of fighting only a few years before, when those shots had struck live bodies and not clay targets. Alex thought of those days as a bad dream, terrible but not true. Did they really happen? We must think about what you must do, Alex, Catriona was saying. I would like to keep you here with me, but you know I cannot do that for long. Soon it will be known that your family is gone, and then, if you're seen in the town, someone may turn you in. You know that. The town council will praise the Komsomol children for that. They'll send you to an orphanage, and they are quite terrible today, overcrowded with the bezprizorni. Bezprizorni are the miserable homeless waifs, so homeless children. She frowned. After a pause, she said, I'm thinking of the eyes of that child who held my place in line. They frightened me. They were so fierce. They threatened rather than pleaded. My God, I wish there was something one could do. The government is too busy defending itself to consider children. She turned her attention to the problem at hand once again. Alex, do you have any relatives in a nearby town? Not nearby. My uncle Dmitri lives in Moscow, but I haven't seen him since he came here 2 years ago. The rest of my relatives live far in the east, 1,000 miles or more. And the word bezprizorny means the wild children, literally shelterless. There's also more vocabulary on at the end of the book. Perhaps then you could go to Moscow to your uncle. Do you know where he lives? He lives off of Tavershaya Street in a house behind a cafe. We had chocolate and rum cake there once. A man played the balalaika. It was a long time ago, but I remember it. Katriana's face brightened. All right, then. Tomorrow we will see about sending you to your uncle. She looked at him with her warm, dark eyes shining with tears. Alex, do not give up hope, she said. Perhaps your family will make contact with him too, and one day you will be reunited. For now, you must be very strong and think about yourself, your future. I will tell you that I wish I could go away from here myself. There now, I have not confessed that to anyone. But where would you go? He was diverted from his misery for the moment by the marvelous fact of becoming her confidant. I'm not sure. Across one of the borders to somewhere in Scandinavia, possibly, and then later, perhaps, to Canada or the United States. Out of the country? Leave Russia? Katriana lowered her voice to a whisper. It is only a dream, of course. Sooner or later, all the old bourgeoisie teachers like me, like your father, will be replaced by young proletariats, anyways. We are suspect. Don't think, Alex, the idea of socialism is bad. It may be good. It's just there are good people and bad people in all systems, and sometimes the good people are overwhelmed by the bad. It is the power that is the evil. How would you get away? Alex asked. Once again, Katriana lowered her voice to a whisper. My brother, Basil Sergeyevich, is a librarian at the Anichkov Palace in St. Petersburg. He has been studying in the seminary to become a priest, but when the seminary was closed, he went to work in the library. He is, well, political. He has helped many people to leave one way or another. I know I could go to him. Living frightened is making me old. And frightened of what? Alex saw now how drawn her thin face was. How sad. We don't even know who or what to fear, and so we fear everyone and everything, Katriana continued. Now in the deep winter, one can feel the desperation everywhere. First the famine, the war with the Germans, the revolutions, Russians against Russians, one's friends disappearing, more famine, people straggling down the roads from other towns looking for anything to eat, and the thousands of homeless children. This is not Mater Rus I have loved, Mother Russia, that I have loved. Oppression, whether from the Reds or Whites, Czar or Bolsheviks, is not bearable. Much as I have loved my homeland, there must be some place better as things are. When would you go? Alex asked, thinking, hoping she might go now with him. I don't know. This is the first time I have thought so clearly on the matter. I know I cannot leave the children in my class in the middle of the school year, leave them to who knows what kind of teaching. Still, I'm going to think about it. I really am. She stopped and clapped her hands over her face. I am talking too much about myself when you are the one with the sad problem now. Alex, I want you to remember where my brother is, just in case you should ever find yourself thinking that way yourself. Alex thought how lovely and real she was in her deepest feelings, just as beautiful as the idol of gilded plaster he had thought her. Now she laid the quilt on the floor for him, and he settled himself on it. She knelt beside him and pulled the quilt over his shoulders, then brushed a cowlick of fair hair off his forehead. Good night, Alex, she said softly. Good night, Katerina Sergeyeva. Was it strange that he fell asleep immediately and did not dream? In those night hours, his waking mind and his sleeping mind fled from truth and into a dark silence of false peace.